Hi, welcome to This Week in Ames. I'm Susan Guiazda. On today's show, we'll get an update on the flood mitigation process. My guest today is John Dunn, Director of the Water and Pollution Control Department. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, you've had a very busy week, and it kind of culminated with the presentation to the Ames City Council recently about final strategies for flood mitigation. The process itself was took very many months and involved a lot of information. Can you just walk us through how we got to that recent presentation?
Well, yeah, the work of the consultant, HDR Engineers, actually started in July of 2012 when the City Council authorized their work to begin. And their study was broken into two main components. The first part was to do some modeling of the flood conditions in Ames and of the watershed basins. So they were looking at developing a hydrologic model, sort of a rainfall model, and then also a hydraulic model, which is what happens once the water hits the ground. And using that, they performed a new statistical calculation to define what constitutes the definition of a 100-year flood, which is an important definition in managing the floodplains. And then they also then, the next phase that they moved into was looking at the development of mitigation alternatives.
So a lot of the, sort of even before the study started, was simply the conditions that we had experienced in Ames over the last decades of flooding, the most recent being in 2010. I think that was sort of a point where the council directed the study to proceed. Yeah,
that was the trigger for kicking off the study. And one of the things that HDR evaluated, like I said, was the definition of the 100-year flood. And that had not been updated since shortly after the 1993 flood, and we've had several large flooding events in the community since then. And statistically, what they found is based on that additional roughly 18 years in the historical record, that the definition of a 100-year flood had a flow that went up anywhere from about 10% to 30%, depending on where in the watershed you were looking at.
So mitigation is an interesting word, and I think it means different things to different people. One of the goals of this was to look at mitigation alternatives. What are some of those options?
Well, in the simplest form, what they meant by mitigation was just looking at trying to reduce the impact of flooding. And you can do that in a couple different ways. You can do it by trying to move properties out of the floodplain. You can do it by trying to protect properties. You could do it by trying to move water out of Ames faster, or you could do it by trying to hold water up in the watershed longer. And the alternatives that HDR developed and looked at ran the gamut of that full spectrum of possibilities.
Now, is it the research that takes so much time? I know there were many months involved, and also there was a public input component. Is that all part of the reason that these studies take so much time?
Yeah, the modeling, while it's a fairly straightforward exercise, it is pretty time intensive. As you mentioned, there was a substantial public involvement component to what happened. We held a series of public workshops that actually started in October of 2012 and continued through to the spring of 2013. As the design team or the engineering team was developing their alternatives, they were repeatedly coming and presenting those to the public in either open house formats, a very informal setting, or we also did the real formal podium presentations with question and answer sessions. In addition to all those in-public meetings, there was also an online meeting that ran the entire time that the study was underway. So through those different mechanisms, we received literally hundreds of comments from the public, and many of those ideas were incorporated into the final evaluation.
Were you surprised by the interest of the public in this topic?
No. Flooding is, it's just something that's part and parcel of being a river community. And we've had so many events in the recent past that it's not surprising at all that this is an interest that a lot of people are really passionate about.
So you mentioned that some of those ideas were incorporated into the final report. And people have been following this one for quite some time. Your presentation to council was sort of an additional step.
Right. In April of 2013, we held a workshop with the council where we presented them a number of individual discrete mitigation measures that could be undertaken. What we were presenting to the council this week was taking those and starting to pair them up in combinations that look like they made sense, both in terms of having some synergistic impacts in terms of reducing the impact of the flooding and also some cost efficiencies. And so we presented to the Ames City Council this week 4 combination alternatives for them to consider.
And I think what again was sort of surprising was the interest in those solutions. Lots of people attended those meetings and lots of people spoke beyond just the borders of Ames.
Yeah, certainly. And many of the public comments that we got could fall into one of 3 categories. And it really depends on where you live, what you would like to see done with flooding. There was a one group of comments that were people who live south of Ames who were saying, please don't do anything to speed up the flow of water. There was people who live north of Ames saying, please don't do anything to slow it down and hold it up. And then there were people in the Ames community who were impacted by flooding who were saying, we need you to do something.
And after the presentation, so April was sort of the workshop where I think initially it was sort of the end of the line. The council had asked for some additional research, which happened recently. Where do we go from here?
Well, the city council will they'll have to weigh the alternatives and decide which, if any of those, that they want to move forward on. The timeline, if a project was going to appear in the next update to the city's capital improvement plan, we would probably need to have some direction by the end of November so that it can be incorporated when that plan gets published in early January.
You mentioned that there were 4 combinations presented recently. Talk about the ones that were, there was a final recommendation?
Yeah, there was one alternative that from the staff perspective seemed like it was the one that made the most sense, and it was in the written report it was referred to as combination alternative number 1, and it involved pairing up 2 individual strategies, one of which was to extend the span of the US Highway 30 bridge by about 400 feet, basically opening up the space under that bridge to allow water to pass through. And in conjunction with that, then doing some reshaping of the Squaw Creek channel in the immediate vicinity of South Duff, going about 1,000 feet or so upstream and downstream of the Duff crossing, and reshaping that channel into a more of a trapezoidal shape. It's a more hydraulically efficient. It would allow water to move through there quicker.
Now, are these kinds of options that are brought forward, are they theoretical, or have they been achieved in other communities?
Oh, these would be strategies that would be common. It's just a matter of finding the right fit.
And they're not cheap.
No, they're not inexpensive. That combination alternative with those 2 paired up together was about $12.5 million. And of that, about $7.7 million was for the bridge, and then the balance, the roughly $4.8 million, was the channel reshaping.
And in general, when you hear from the public, obviously everybody has their own sort of concerns, but is there concern about doing something versus doing nothing? Or is it that we're not headed in the right direction? What are some of the criteria you kind of think about when you're looking to proceed?
Oh, there's a lot of different perspectives that folks are looking at. Certainly if they own or live in property that's impacted by flooding, they desperately want to see some sort of protection from that. There's also a different school of thought, which is that the individual property owners should buy flood insurance and protect themselves, and that perhaps it's not an obligation of the government to protect them from that. There are folks who have interest in issues like water quality, doing some land management practices further in the watershed that would have benefits both in terms of flood protection and just in general water quality. There's folks who have concerns about environmental impacts of any of the mitigation strategies. That's certainly an important consideration as well. So it is such a complex issue, and there are so many different perspectives that need to be considered. That's what makes this such a challenging process. Some folks are frustrated that we've had this flooding that goes back decades, and why hasn't anything been done? And the answer is there is no low-hanging fruit here. There is no easy answer. If there was, it would have happened 20 years ago.
Well, and you and I have talked about the fact that really every rain event is different. And there is a sense from some property owners that they want to know exactly what's going to happen to their property in every situation. Now, can you tell them?
No. If somebody were to tell me, when is it going to rain? What's the pattern of the rainfall? Where in the watershed is it going to fall? How much rain have we had in the 2 weeks prior to that? How high are the rivers at the time the rain falls? If I know all of that, I can probably give you a pretty good estimate as to how high it's going to get. But you're right. Every rainfall event is different. Just in terms of, even if you get the same amount of rain, where it falls in the watershed, the timing of the peak between the Squaw Creek and the Skunk River has a significant impact on what the flood heights are that we see in the South Duff. So it's a pretty complex issue to be able to give a single discrete answer to.
I think one of the offers of help that you've given to people in the past has been the website tool that could superimpose a particular rain event on the Ames watershed area, and then it shows you if this rain event happened here, which properties would be affected.
Yeah, that's a really neat tool that came out of this study. HDR was partnered with the Iowa Flood Center through the University of Iowa to do the modeling and the mapping. And if people were to go to the Iowa Flood Center website, which is iowafloodcenter.org, and go to the flood information system following the links through there, you can get to the community flood mapping. And you can pull up a high resolution map where you can zoom in on your specific property, and then by adjusting a slider bar, tell it, do you want to look at what the flooding would be like on a 10-year flood, a 50-year flood, a 500-year flood, and it will give you a map. Now there might be a desire to be able to trust those maps implicitly, and I would hope people remember when they go there that that's a theoretical projection. And I always tell people, don't let what you hear on the news or from somebody like me interfere with your own best judgment. People are the best judges of the history of their property, and they should protect themselves. But in terms of planning ahead and protecting, that inundation mapping tool is a really, really handy thing.
It is, again, ironic to be talking about flood mitigation in the midst of a drought, but we know that this is probably a temporary weather pattern, and we could see a different situation next spring.
Oh, we certainly saw that this spring. Coming out of 2012 was a pretty severe drought, and earlier this year we had river stages that were 2-3 feet above flood stage, and then once that was gone, we went back into a drought pattern. So
any predictions for spring of 2014?
There is no such thing as normal. It's just the median point between two extremes.
So do you envision the flood mitigation project, do you consider it wrapped up, or will this sort of continue on for a little bit more?
I think that the study phase has reached its conclusion. It provided the alternatives that were asked for. Now it's back in the hands of the city, and we need to make the decisions as to what's going to happen. In terms of timing, when any construction would start, I would expect that we would probably spend the first year trying to line up funding for whatever project we were going to do. And then once we had that funding mechanism lined up, then there'd be a period of time for design, and then some not insignificant environmental reviews and permitting that would need to happen. So it would probably be about 3 years out before any construction actually were to begin.
Well, John, I appreciate the update on flood mitigation. It's been a big project for you and your department, but I can't let you go without just getting an update on our water plant.
Yeah, that process is well underway in design. We're probably, I would say, roughly at about 70% complete on the design. We are on schedule to have the design completed in March of 2014. We're assuming about a 3-month window for permitting of that. And so a notice to bidders will likely happen in July of 2014. And hopefully a year from now, there will be a hole in the ground in that property out on East 13th Street.
So a groundbreaking for 2014.
in the fall 2014.
And then a construction time frame of how long?
It will take about 2.5 years for that facility to go up, so we're expecting the first drops of water will go through that facility in the spring of 2017.
Again, that spot on East 13th Street, it's marked with a big sign, and people might remember that as the former home of...
The USDA had some research facilities there. It's the parcel that sits on the south side of 13th Street between the Harley shop and the river.
Sort of up on the hill there.
Up on the bluffs.
Great. Well, thanks, John, for taking the time. I know you're busy. It's always good to catch up.
Absolutely.
Well, I have some things to mark on your calendar for November. Remember, as Thanksgiving approaches, the City Hall and most city offices will be closed on November 28th and 29th. Also, don't forget, if you still have leaves, we have 2 yard waste free days coming up. The last 2 are November 16th and November 30th. Those are from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., and you can get more information on our website. Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for watching, and tune in next week for This Week in Ames.